Thank you for having me today. Again, my name is Justin Burks. I'm a water conservation specialist. I specialize in graywater and landscape water use management at the district, providing rebate programs as well as services to our constituents throughout the county. Today I'll be providing you an overview of who the district is, where our water comes from, just a general overview about the drought and our current water supply conditions, and I hope to be able to spend at least a decent amount of time on our programs and rebate services, because that's where my knowledge and passion is. But I am really excited about your next month's event, because I used to be in open space planning, and that sounds like a really exciting meeting, so I hope I'm at least comparable to that. So without further ado, I'll get started. And feel free to ask questions, and if for any reason I'm unable or answer your questions incompletely, I did leave my card in a few places around this room today, so feel free to send me a follow-up email, and I'll be sure to find the best person to provide a full response to you. So this is our headquarters. We're located off of Almaden Expressway in South San Jose. We are not your water company. We are a groundwater management agency and a water wholesaler, so we ensure there's a safe, clean water supply in our rivers and creeks around us, and also in the aquifer beneath our feet. But if you have any questions about rebate programs or flood control, this is what the building looks like. So we cut our teeth as a groundwater management agency. So we started in 1929 when orchards and groves still covered much of Santa Clara County. We formed in response to subsidence, which is where the aquifer begins to get overdrafted and land literally sinks. So in response to that situation, we formed so that basically in response to people's concerns about needing to dig deeper wells, build stronger pumps to make sure they had water to irrigate their orchards. That's what was the catalyst to form our agency back in 1929. But that's not the end of our story. As I mentioned, like the rebate programs and services that I help manage falls into one of three pillars: clean, reliable water. We also provide flood protection services for the county, and we also maintain healthy creeks and streams, and it's really important to us to maintain a healthy aquatic habitat throughout the county, because that is directly connected to our water supply and also our individual properties. So that is our range of services. We are governed by a board of directors who you may vote for periodically. They represent various districts throughout the county. Santa Clara County has a little more than 1.9 million people that either live here or commute here. The water district serves, I believe, 14 municipalities through the county, 4,700 private well owners, and 13 water providers. So the water providers are your water company, which may be a private water company, like San Jose Water Company or Cal Water, or a public municipality like San Jose Municipal Water Services or the City of Mountain View, just for example. Does anyone have any questions before I start talking about where we get our water? Yes, miss.
I just had a quick question. Are those positions paid? Just curious.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
No, not really. They get a stipend, but they're basically, so they get paid for every board meeting, and then they get paid some expenses.
But it's not.
Yeah, it's basically a volunteer thing.
Right, good question. And they are elected, and that's all their names, so feel free to learn more about them. Because they are a really engaged board, and it is really beneficial to be aware of who your elected representatives are, even in special districts like the Santa Clara Valley Water District. So we get our water, historically, on average, about a little more than half of our water is imported through the Central Valley Water Project and the State Water Project. 30% is local, 5% recycled, and actually the conservation savings is closer to 15% of that total now, and during the 5-year drought we just got out of, it was, as you're all familiar with, it was an upwards of 28 to 30% conservation savings. So we really invest in having adequate, relatively easy to participate in programs to help protect our entire water supply portfolio. I saw a few hands come up.
Well, when you say conservation savings, I think I would appreciate an explanation of what that means. If you're talking about, purple pipe recycled water coming back. Otherwise, I mean, I can see we've done lots of things to reduce our use, but if you're talking about supply, I'm confused.
That gets to what I was going to say, because I was just going to say, there's been a movement to take that conservation piece of the pie and move it to the demand side, because it really makes more sense over there. So I hope the water district's going to move in that direction, because like your proven point, it doesn't really make sense. Right? Does everybody agree?
Yes.
Great question. Feel free to email me.
Yeah,
I
it's
can
just
give you
they're
a
showing it on the
reducing
wrong
demand,
side.
it's
It's
not-
reducing demand.
Okay,
It's not
let's
increasing supply.
suggest the chance here.
So we count it as part of our supply because it is a supply. If we didn't have any water conservation programs, we would need to build enough infrastructure and water supply, either reservoirs or plants, to meet that approaching 15% that we're getting from conservation. So that's why that's why we count it towards as part of our supply portfolio, because it is. By cost per acre foot of water saved from our conservation programs, it's one of the most cost-effective investments that you can make in your water supply portfolio relative to building new reservoirs or building new importing water agreements. It is part of that portfolio. Great question though, and
I wouldn't
yes.
argue
Other
with
places
that.
have changed.
Hold on a second.
Other places.
I wouldn't argue with what you said, that it's a wonderful thing. But then you talk about 10% savings against which baseline? Right? So now you have to say which baseline. Is it the 1978 baseline that you have 10% conservation savings against? It just really doesn't make sense to have it here.
So our water supply portfolio, if I recall correctly, is from a 1993 baseline in regards to how much savings we're getting, and we have modern modeling that actually accounts for what are our assumptions for what we're saving. What do we expect how do we expect these savings to continue going forward in the future? For example, if you replace a 30-year-old toilet that uses 3.5 gallons per flush, is that savings for 1 year or savings for 20 years? And so we have models that we build into that question. But it is a very nuanced answer that is important to ask, because when we talk about making a 20% reduction in your usage, like we did in 2016, or a 30% reduction in the years before that, that was a 2013 baseline, because that was the last year where the population and water use was quote unquote a normal year, where it was a relatively wet year that year, if I recall correctly, and we've been out of we were coming out of the recession still. And so in regards to those, save 20%, value our water, that was a 2013 baseline. In regards to this water supply portfolio, I did my best to answer that question, and please email me and I will get you the very specific answer. Yes?
It says the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta, but you don't actually show or list the San Joaquin River on there. Some of the water is coming from the San Joaquin River system.
That's a great point. I will correct that in a future slide. Thank you. Yes, next.
I'm just wondering, how is conservation keeping pace with growth of industry and development housing?
That's a great question. I have a slide later in the presentation, so feel free to ask that question again if I don't adequately answer it. Yes, miss.
And do we get any water from Hetch Hetchy, or is that all San Francisco? Okay, Crystal Springs.
Yes, about, so at the average supply, the 55% that's imported, 15% is from the San Francisco PUC. So that's from Hetch Hetchy, and then the rest is conveyed from the Delta. Actually, this is basically, well, actually, no, this is, I jumped the boat. This shows three things. It shows, it's trying to communicate about subsidence relative to our aquifer levels and population. So the orange line on the top is the land surface elevation. Groundwater elevation is in the blue, and our population is the green. Note where the 0 point is in the middle of this axis. So when we formed around 1929, there's a steep decline in groundwater elevation. As I had mentioned earlier, that corresponded to 13 feet of subsidence throughout the county, and worse in specific areas. Then we started participating in, I think we started building our reservoirs around this time, around the 1950s. That was when Anderson was built, if I recall correctly. It began declining again. Then the state water project and the federal water project. And then you can see the most recent drought. So there is a direct connection between how we invest in our water infrastructure and what the state of our aquifer is beneath our feet. As subsidence worsens, it creates various negative impacts. That includes increasing the likelihood of saltwater intrusion into our aquifer. That increases the risk of flooding, and it also increases the risk of damaging existing infrastructure. So investing in maintaining we use a normal stage of how much water we store in our aquifer, that is a sound investment to ensure that additional problems aren't exacerbated. So with sea level rise, that would be even worse if we did not maintain strategies to ensure that we have enough water in our aquifer, because the land would literally get lower over time. Yes?
Do we have a sense of what the aquifer elevation it was before a bunch of people got here?
Well, it's kind of showing it right here. So our aquifer holds, if I recall correctly, it's around 350,000 acre feet over time. And so I know that's not specifically illustrated on this graphic, but relativistically you can kind of compare
A lot
it.
of artesian wells, just really pretty high water tables. There still are, actually, as you get closer to the bay, like by the airport. I mean, there was just water literally coming out of the ground.
So it's because of human activity that the groundwater got depleted. It's not a natural.
Yeah, we were formed because of the vast amount of farming initially that was pumping water out of the aquifer, and then there's other effects after that.
Just to
Yes, sir.
To clarify that, they say the blue line, it starts, if I'm reading the left scale, at 100 foot. So are you saying essentially back in the early days that the groundwater level was that 100 foot above sea level? Was that the natural background level where we started from, 100 foot above sea level?
Great question. I'll have to follow up with you on that because I'm not exactly sure. The depth to groundwater throughout the county is very variable throughout the county. As Katia was mentioning, areas around Alviso and certain areas of Palo Alto, in a high rainfall year, you're going to get seepage and what appears to be runoff in a lot of areas because it's a full groundwater and a lot of water coming into it. Yeah. Other areas throughout the county may not exhibit that, even though there's a lot of water.
That is confusing, 100 feet to.
Yeah, I'll please follow. That's a great question for me to follow up on. Thank you. Yes, miss.
So if I read it right, from approximately 1960 when the groundwater was most depleted, and that's probably when a lot of, I'm presuming that's when a lot of the subsidence started to occur, and then until now, where the population has increased, and yet it looks like the measures of reservoirs and things like that have managed to replenish a lot most of the water.
Correct, and to mitigate the negative impacts
That would
of
be
this
because of
additional people.
conservation.
Also.
And also conservation.
Yeah.
Because it is part of our water supply. Like again, all those efforts have a very powerful impact on the natural environment around us and on our ability to have healthy communities and economies.
That's all aquifer, that's what that bottom part, the bottom 4/5 or 5/6 of the graph is indicating?
Yes, the blue up and down is the groundwater elevation changes. So around 1929 was around when we were formed and reservoirs started getting built. In post-World War II, the population exploded in Santa Clara County. And in response to that, we started importing water from the State Water Project. So you can see the impact on our groundwater elevation with some of those key elements of our history. Yes, sir.
Do you expect the land subsidence to reverse and actually come back up if you keep the aquifers up toward the top there? Otherwise, you know, when the aquifer was low, you had that subsidence, and it hasn't come back up at all, even though the water has come back.
That's a great question. One of my colleagues is one of our groundwater unit managers and specialists, and I can put you in contact with them about that question. But my impression is that once subsidence happens, it can be very difficult to reverse, just because of the geology of the county and our infrastructure around it. When that ground sinks, it's much better to mitigate that from ever happening than try to pump the water underneath it to bring it back up. But that's just my best ability to answer that question, unfortunately. Yes, miss?
Well, I always thought of it as kind of like you squeezed a sponge and the holes are gone. You can't pull the holes back up again. I don't know if that's really simplistic.
I think that's comparable, and I like the sponge analogy with runoff
Except it
after
doesn't
a
bounce
drought
back.
also. Yeah, it doesn't bounce back. Or like after a 5 or 6 year drought, it's almost like a dry sponge. If we get a ton of rainfall, like the record-setting rainfall we had last year, the ability for the soil to hold on to that water isn't as effective as if we'd had a regular series of rainfall during those years, and it can't take in that water. So I think it is a comparable analogy to that.
So if you've got the groundwater level high, but the land is lower, that means the aquifer can't hold as much water as it used to?
That's
Because
my
all the
best assessment.
spaces have been compressed?
And so that's why we have so much investment, and that's why we have so much investment in preventing subsidence from happening, because it's much easier to prevent it than trying to react to it after it happens.
I have a question. Are you
Yes.
going to talk about perk ponds at any point?
I meant to mention percolation ponds at the beginning, so thank you for bringing that up. He mentioned about perk ponds, so those are various ponds that you may see around Vistona Park, or actually around the Santa Clara Valley Water District's headquarters. Those were dry for many years during the drought. When we have a sufficient water supply, we put water directly in those percolation ponds, and that is how water gets back into our aquifer. So we identify these areas where we have these percolation ponds that get maintained to actually take in water throughout the county. So one process that we did